In the first two movies, Paul Atreides is the main character of the series, which is not surprising since both of those movies are based on the first Dune book. But the original Dune series, written by Frank Herbert, consists of 6 books in total: Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. Paul Atreides' story only covers the first 2 books of the saga, while his son, Leto II, is the main character for 3 of those books, and surprisingly is also still present in the last 2 books. Their stories are full of hardships and conflicts. While at first they may look similar to each other, there is more to it than it seems at first glance. Leto and his sister Ghanima make their debut by the end of the second book, Dune Messiah. Unfortunately, Chani gives birth to twins who come into the world fully conscious with Kwisatz Haderach-like access to ancestral memories. The son is a total surprise for Paul, who had only foreseen the birth of their daughter. Scytale, a face dancer of the Beni Tleilax, offers to revive Chani as a Gola, an artificially created human who is replicated from a dead individual, but Paul refuses to submit, considering the possibility that the Tleilaxu might program Chani in some diabolical way. The face dancer then threatens the infants with a knife to force Paul to accept, and also demands all of his Choam holdings in return. By successfully escaping the oracular trap and setting the universe on a new path, Paul has been rendered completely blind, yet he can kill Scytale with an accurately aimed dagger due to a psychic vision from his son's perspective. Later that evening, Bijaz, who was a Tleilaxu master and a prescient dwarf who is immune to others' prescience, approaches Paul and repeats Scytale's offer, but is killed by Duncan Idaho, who is revived as a Gola, but retained all of the past memories with House Atreides on Paul's order. Now prophetically and physically blind, Paul chooses to embrace the Fremen tradition of a blind man walking alone in the desert, winning the loyalty of the Fremen for his children, who will inherit his empire. Paul leaves his sister Alia, now romantically involved with Duncan, as regent for the twins. Alia orders the execution of Edric, Mohiam, and others involved in the plot against her brother, going against his wish that none of them should be hurt. Alia spares Princess Irulan, who, in grief for Paul, has renounced her loyalty to the Bene Gesserit and vowed to dedicate her life as a teacher to Paul's children. Duncan notes the irony that Paul and Chani's deaths have enabled them to triumph against their enemies. The Spacing Guild and the Beni Tleilax have been discredited. Irulan's defection from the Bene Gesserit removes the Sisterhood's last lever against the Atreides, and Paul has escaped deification by walking into the desert as a man, while guaranteeing support for the Atreides line. And this is how Dune Messiah ends. The book did not give us any explicit information about Leto's future, but it gave us pretty good outliner about him and his personality. It's crucial to consider the circumstances outlined in the Dune Messiah and later in Children of Dune, which heavily influenced Leto's destiny from the outset. Firstly, his birth is marked by the dual omens of death and twinning. Twins are born pre-born, initiated into the melange and capable of sight and communication almost immediately after birth. Leto and Ghanima lack distinct individual identities in their early days. They are often simply referred to as the twins, reinforcing the sense that they are facets of a single entity. Their physical resemblance further supports this notion. Their faces bore the imprint of shared genes, generous mouths, widely spaced eyes of spice addict blue on blue. Their names add another layer of ambiguity, with Ghanima meaning spoil of war, carrying a martial rather than feminine connotation, while Leto evokes the mythic figure who bore twins, Apollo and Artemis's mother. Essentially, the Atreides twins possess an indistinct sexual identity, appearing as if they are split reflections of an androgynous being. The next book, Children of Dune, takes place 9 years after Paul Muad'Dib walked into the desert blind. The ecological transformation of Dune has reached the point where some Fremen are living without stillsuits in the less arid climate and have started to move out of the sieches and into the villages and cities. As the old ways erode, more and more pilgrims arrive to experience the planet of Muad'Dib. The Imperial High Council has lost its political might and is powerless to control the jihad. In this book, Leto's internal conflict about his and his sister identities become more clear. It is clear that as far as the twins are concerned, the self is not exclusively another one, but a multitude of others at the same time, while Leto himself sums it up in a most revealing sentence, "The entire universe with all its time is within me." He even confesses to the faithful Stilgar, "I have no first-person singular still. I am a multiple person with memories of traditions more ancient than you could imagine." He is only 9 years old while he is going through all of this, which is to say, from a purely objective and biological point of view, he is only a child. However, he never once contemplates being one. This is a child's body, no doubt about that. But I am not a child. He keeps on repeating, or again, I'm an adult in a child's flesh. Obviously, there is in him a total discrepancy between his physical being and his psyche. In other words, between the envelope and the self, the container and the content. Of course, this is true of Ghanima as well, and it is no mere coincidence if, in the presence of the twins, even their family circle calls them unchildren or immature bodies. Their inner identity problem was not the only conflict the twins underwent. Leto and his sister became the legal responsibility of Paul's younger sister, the regent Alia. Though they were granted a fine upbringing, little attention was bestowed upon them by their aunt, who was possessed by an abomination and enthralled by her own power and the mysticism developed around the Atreides name by Paul. Abomination was a term used most commonly by the Bene Gesserit to describe individuals who could not control the ego, memories that had surfaced with them. These ego memories usually surfaced after consumption of the water of life, or through direct genetic inheritance in preborn children. The classic example of abominations was Alia Atreides, who was a fetus when her mother, the Lady Jessica, converted the water of life and became a reverend mother. Being too young and weak to control the plethora of dynamic personalities that invaded her body via genetic memory, Alia was never able to adjust to her situation and eventually succumbed to the personality of Vladimir Harkonnen. Paul's young twin children, Leto II and Ghanima, have concluded that their aunt Alia has succumbed to an abomination, possession by her grandfather, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and fear that a similar fate awaits them. They, and Alia, also realize that the terraforming of Dune will kill all the sandworms, thus destroying the source of the spice, but Baron Harkonnen desires this outcome. Leto also fears that, like his father, he will become trapped by his prescience. Meanwhile, a new religious figure called the Preacher has risen in the desert, rallying against the religious government's injustices and the changes among the Fremen. Some Fremen believe he is Paul Atreides. Princess Wensichia of the fallen House Carino and Seleucia Secundus plots to assassinate the twins and regain power for her house. When they were 9 years old, Leto and Ghanima gained the attention of their paternal grandmother, Lady Jessica, who returned to Arrakis from Caladan to inspect them as part of her obligations to the Bene Gesserit. Interestingly enough, the only planet that was spared the raging fire of Muad'Dib's jihad was the home world of House Atreides, Caladan. Lady Jessica, mother of Paul Muad'Dib, refused the Fremen any access to the planet, including religious pilgrimage. While visiting, Jessica sensed the Bene Gesserit power present in the twins, and upon the realization that they could be a threat to the psychologically unstable Alia, pressed her Fremen allies to help protect them. Leto arranges for Fremen leader Stilgar to protect Ghanima if there is an attempt on their lives. Alia, who is possessed by Baron Harkonnen, attempts to assassinate Jessica, who escapes into the desert with Duncan's help, precipitating a rebellion among the Fremen. The twins anticipate and survive the Carino assassination plot, faking Leto's death. Leto then leaves to seek out Jacurutu, a mythical Fremen siege and possible holdout of the Preacher, while Ghanima, changing her memory with self-hypnosis, reports and believes that her brother has been murdered. Duncan and Jessica flee to Seleucia Secundus, where Jessica begins to mentor Farad in the ways of the Bene Gesserit. He sidelines and quickly denounces his regent mother Wesnichia over the assassination attempt on the twins and allies with the Bene Gesserit, who promise to marry him to Ghanima and support his bid to become emperor. A band of Fremen outlaws capture Leto and force him to undergo the spice trance at the suggestion of Gurney Halleck, who has infiltrated the group on Jessica's orders. Leto's spice-induced visions show him a myriad possible futures where humanity becomes extinct and only one where it survives. He names this future the Golden Path and resolves to bring it to fruition, something that his father, who had already glimpsed this future, refused to do. At first, the Golden Path appeared to culminate in the ascent of House Atreides, jihad, the spread of Fremen customs, and the terraforming of Arrakis. While Paul turned from the horror of the intrinsic suffering involved, Leto II saw his role and that this path was ultimately required for humanity's long-term survival. Leto eschewed prescience as a necessary, though ultimately tedious and lonely, curse. However, he used it, harnessing the infinite awareness of his abomination. While this had turned his father to the desert and his aunt Alia to madness, he struck a deal of sorts with his multitudes, his sanity and access to infinite memory contingent upon his sacrificing of the self for the path. He escapes his captors and sacrifices his humanity in pursuit of the Golden Path by physically fusing with a school of sand trout, the larval form of sandworms, and began the conversion into a human-sandworm hybrid. So we know that on Arrakis, there are creatures known as sand trout, and they are basically these little creatures that swim around in the sand and ingest water. The sand trouts are actually the proto-life form of the sandworms, so eventually, after a bunch of sand trouts merged, they become the single worm, continuing to merge and becoming the sandworm that we all know of. So Leto II, because of his Bene Gesserit inherited abilities, is able to take the sand trout, manipulate his own chemistry in such a way to allow a symbiotic relationship to form, so he allowed the sand trout to basically fuse with him and become a part of his body. In the early stage of this transformation, it was more like a sand trout skin. However, as the millennia went on, the transformation continued and he became a more worm-like creature that looks anything but human. This transformation, which in the beginning was essentially a form of exoskeleton, boosted Leto's strength, reflexes, and speed immensely, and he was able to move across large distances on foot, in the process gaining superhuman strength and near invulnerability. He travels across the desert, destroying Qanats to slow down the ecological transformation of Dune, and eventually confronts the Preacher, who is indeed Paul. When Paul walked into the desert many years ago, he truly wanted to die. He ran from Leto's vision, and Leto felt that tensions grew between himself and his father. Paul insists to Leto that he cannot control the future, but Leto knew that one of them would have to act and make a decision, choosing a vision. Leto understood, however, that his father was correct. Attempting to take ultimate control of the universe could only lead to the ultimate defeat. To manage such a vision required a balance of a single thin thread, to play God on a tight wire with cosmic solitude on both sides. Leto had committed himself down a path in which there was no turning back from, and he had accepted the consequences of that choice. Paul, however, had made no final commitment. Even though Paul begs him not to, Leto stays in line with his own vision. He jumps meters into the air, catching Tarek, who was the child guide for Paul Atreides as the Preacher. When he tried to kill Paul and Leto Atreides II, Leto killed him. Paul had been defeated. Leto looked at his father and saw a blind, angry man full of despair. "Do you know the universe you have created here?" Leto heard the particular emphasis. The vision, which both of them knew had been set into terrible motion here, had required an act of creation at a certain point in time. In that moment, the entire sentient universe shared a linear view of time, which possessed characteristics of orderly progression. They entered this time as they might step onto a moving vehicle, and they could not leave it the same way. Paul asks Leto if he is truly prepared to commit to his fate, if he is truly willing to change and live for thousands of years. He wonders if Leto is ready to accept what he will be to the universe. Do you wish to live those thousands of years, changing as you know now you will change? Leto knew that his father was not talking about the physical changes. Both of them knew the physical consequences. Leto would adapt and adapt. The skin, which was not his own, would adapt and adapt. The evolutionary thrust of each would melt into the other, and a single transformation would emerge. When the metamorphosis came, if it came, a thinking creature of awesome dimensions would emerge upon the universe, and that universe would worship him. No, Paul was referring to the inner changes, the thoughts and decisions which would inflict themselves upon upon the worshippers. It is the moment when Leto first talks about the metamorphosis, the millennium-long change that will shape his body into an inhuman form. He will be worshipped, and his grip of the universe will be stronger than his own father's ever was, or could have ever dreamed to be. Thousands of peaceful years, Leto said. That's what I will give them. Dormancy, stagnation, Paul said. Of course, and those forms of violence which I will permit. It will be a lesson which humankind will never forget. I spit on your lesson, Paul said. You think I have not seen a similar thing to what you choose? You saw it, Leto agreed. Is your vision any better than mine? Not one bit better. Worse, perhaps, Leto said. Then what can I do but resist you? Paul demanded. Paul concedes to Leto, acknowledging that this is his universe now. He knew that he would have no comfort this night or any other. He knew that Muad'Dib must be destroyed. Paul Atreides, the hero, must die. Only the preacher could survive. Meanwhile, Alia began to show the signs of possession in her physical form. Her flesh is beginning to change from the prolonged abomination. She has grown more and more deranged. Duncan returns to Arrakis and provokes Stilgar into killing him so that Stilgar is forced to take Ghanima and go into hiding. Eventually, though, Alia recaptures Ghanima and arranges her marriage to Farad, planning to exploit the expected chaos when Ghanima kills him to avenge her brother's murder. After his transformation had progressed to a sufficient stage, Leto emerged from the desert and returned to the city of Arrakeen, where Lady Jessica and Farad had arrived for his betrothal to Ghanima to confront Alia. Upon arriving, Paul is publicly murdered by agents of her government, to Alia's horror. Leto reveals himself in a display of superhuman strength and triggers the return of Ghanima's genuine memories. He confronts Alia and offers to help her overcome her possession, but Baron Harkonnen resists. Alia, whilst fighting Baron Harkonnen's possession, manages to take her own life by throwing herself off a high balcony. After Alia managed to briefly overcome her possession and take her own life, Leto claimed the title of Padishah God Emperor and promptly married his sister to consolidate his hegemony. The marriage was purely legal. Ghanima accepted Farad and Corrino as her mate, but their descendants would be known as Atreides. Shortly after his ascendancy, Leto ordered a new Ghola of Swordmaster Duncan Idaho from the Beni Tleilax to serve him as commander of the Royal Guard, as the original Hate Ghola had been killed by the Fremen Naib Stilgar during the last days of Alia's regency. During the earliest years of his reign, Leto used the existing Fremen forces as well as Farad'n's Sardaukar troops, which he had given to him upon his ascension to the throne, to enforce his rule. His armies of Fremen and Sardaukar were commanded by a series of Idaho Gholas, which would usually be replaced after they tried to kill him, and he killed them in response, although very occasionally he allowed them to have natural deaths. Over the centuries, Leto's empire, which he ruled as the God Emperor, became multi-galactic through gradual growth. Very early on in this expansion, Leto suppressed the ancient order of Mentats and banned the training of Mentats because they formed a nucleus of independent opposition. A little more than 3,500 years have passed, and in God Emperor of Dune, Leto is now almost fully transformed into a sandworm. He is almost invulnerable to physical damage. Only his face is susceptible to injury, and his single greatest weakness that he shares with the sandworms, an intense vulnerability to water, is a secret. Leto's peace has kept the universe quiet for that time, and the entirety of human society has become an audience for him. He is their emperor. He is their god. While for centuries the Fremen and Sardaukar legions were enough for Leto, he ultimately decided that these forces were unsuitable to his needs. Leto believed that male-dominated military forces were essentially predatory and would turn against the civilian population in the absence of an external enemy, whereas a female one would be tame and calm. He also needed a reliable religious organization to enforce what was coming to be known as Leto's Peace to ensure the unfolding of the Golden Path. Because of this, he founded a new all-female army to serve him, commanded by the continuing series of Duncan Idahos. Leto named the army the fish speakers because the first priestesses spoke to fish in their dreams. Although the fish speakers were all female, males were still employed as house guards, and their commander Idaho was male. With the exception of the nomadic Amazons who legend described as once ruling part of the Asian steppes of Old Earth, the fish speakers were just about the only effective all-female army known throughout the history of the universe. They were also, in terms of worlds ruled and historical longevity, the most effective military force ever known. The desolate Dune is gone. Arrakis is now a verdant planet with a great river named after Duncan, Idaho. Except for Leto, the sandworms are extinct, and all that is left of the ocean without water, Bar Belama, is a desert reserve set aside for Leto alone. This remnant is called the Sarir and is about the size of California. The old institutions, the Bene Gesserit, the Bene Tleilax, the Spacing Guild, the Houses Major and Minor, the Landsraad, the technocrats of Ix and Choam, have all faded from power in the face of Leto's hydraulic despotism. Since he has absolute control of the spice on which the whole universe depends, he has the universe in the palm of his hand and ruthlessly enforces this simplistic order. Leto has taken over the Bene Gesserit's breeding program for himself, the same program that produced his father, the Kwisatz Haderach. His golden path is nearly assured now, and his long rule has begun to bore him. The trap of prescience is an existence without surprises. To ensure that humanity will serve, Leto has spent millennia enforcing quiescence on humanity. People rarely travel, rarely fight in wars, rarely do anything but live and worship him. This repression has created in humanity a deep and urgent need to explode upon the universe, scattering itself beyond the reach of any single tyrant. Leto seeks a solution in which he might die without destroying his people. If a god commits suicide, his worshippers would commit suicide with him. The only option is revolution, so Leto breeds the only person who will overthrow him, Siona Atreides, the daughter of his majordomo, Moneo. Siona is the second human to carry a gene that makes her invisible to prescience and thus uncontainable by it, the first being the Count Fenrig from the novel Dune. Siona is different from Fenrig in that she can pass on this gene to her descendants, whereas Fenrig was a genetic eunuch. Since Siona cannot be seen in a vision, she cannot be controlled by a vision, nor can her descendants. Thus, the tyranny of prescience will end with Siona. Humanity can never again be bound by a powerful prescient like Muad'Dib or the God Emperor himself. Siona's partner in revolution is Duncan, Idaho, the constant companion of Leto throughout the long millennia. For his entire reign, Leto has had a Ghola of Duncan in charge of his fish speaker army. The Duncans represent the old Atreides loyalty along with everything vital in humanity, so something in the Duncans always rebels against the blasphemous chimera Leto has made of himself. Many Duncans die trying to kill Leto. When Siona finally arrives, she finds in Duncan a justification for revolt. At that time, Leto Atreides was viewed as simply God. His origins were purposefully obscured. Only the most high-ranked entities such as Bene Gesserit and Bene Tleilax knew the fact that Leto, just like everyone else, used to be human, a son of previous Emperor Paul Atreides. Average humans in Leto's empire were less aware about his nature. They were viewing him as God, as an incomprehensible being who was above every other entity in the universe. Leto had realized that it was much easier to regain his position and control his empire in a way to make other people feel like he was truly a god, an immortal being with no weaknesses. However, Leto possessed a major weakness that every other human has, an ability to love. While Leto lived on for millennia, his sister and wife Ghanima, being but a mortal human woman, died after a relatively normal life in the first years of Leto's rule. After being told of her death, Leto, heartbroken, wrote this in his journals. The sand beach as gray as a dead cheek. A green tide flow reflects cloud ripples. I stand on the dark, wet edge. Cold foam cleanses my toes. I smell driftwood smoke. He pressed a strand of Ganima's hair with a starflower blossom which she once brought to him between these pages of the journal. Leto Atreides learns this after stealing Leto's journals, where she reads the passage about the death of Ganima. She was very excited since this seemed the only weakness of the God Emperor that she and other rebels were able to get their hands on. Meanwhile, the rest of the universe is scheming to kill Leto as well. Leto Atreides was not the only one who got this information about Leto. The Bene Tleilax also learned it from Malki, who was the Ixian ambassador to Arrakis during the later years of the reign of Leto Atreides II, the God Emperor. He was known to have unofficial dispensation to discuss taboo topics with Leto because Leto was fond of him. He apparently possessed some special insight into Leto and his golden path. He was one of the closest persons to Leto and had greater understanding to Leto's weakness, which was the reason why the Bene Tleilax had that much of an upper hand against Leto. Inside the first No Chamber, the Ixians grow their replacement for Malki, his niece, Hui Nari, a creature of pure goodness. Where Malki failed, Hui succeeds. Leto falls in love with her and plans to marry her. At first glance, the plan of the Bene Tleilax looks to be going how they envisioned it, but they did not expect Leto to get his love back from Hui. She asks Leto to share their souls since they cannot interact physically after Leto's loss of humanity. Her deep empathy and ability to see beyond the abyss that separates Leto from all human beings, an abyss that no other woman would ever dare to cross, and to love him brings a tear in each of his eyes. Earlier, it was remarked that the God Emperor was unable to shed tears, partly because of the disrupting effect water had on his worm body, and partly because of the Fremen inherited inhibition of wasting body water. The discussion during which that matter had been brought up sparked a deep interest and concern for Hui. Although the Atreides, namely Moneo and Siona, that surround him needed to be shown by activating their genetically inherited prescient powers, the absolute horrors that could only be avoided by Leto's apparent tyranny in order for them to support the Golden Path, Hui is able to understand without having seen any proof of altruism in Leto's actions and the ultimate sacrifice that he had to make, and is able to love him. In that moment they share, which brings forth the deepest emotions in Leto's current life, emotions thought forgotten. Fear, surprise, admiration, understanding, and being understood, and ultimately that moment of true happiness that he had lost hope for. Leto's ability to love was not the only weakness Leto Atreides learned. Leto was residing in the only desert that existed in the terraformed Earth, the only place where he could roam freely. By chance, once, while he was visited by Siona, his weather machines, which were keeping the desert without water, malfunctioned, which resulted in the brief rain, and Siona saw the effect that the water had on Leto. She saw the blue smoke rising from every place the water touched him. When Leto's sand trout's skin is touched by rainwater, it starts the process of separation. His body begins to start the true spice essence, which Siona sees as puffs of blue smoke. She realized that the ultimate weakness to Leto was water. It could be her biggest weapon against him. This information becomes key to her plan to end the rule of God Emperor Leto. Leto planned to wed Hui in what remains of an old Fremen village near the former Siege Tabor, but changes his mind at the last instant to use the Museum Fremen's Tuono village, the royal peregrination, the journey on foot for any of Leto's trips. The Tuono has all the appearance of a normal trip. However, Siona and Duncan are both well aware of the God Emperor's coming. Siona uses her power over Nyla, Leto's pet fish speaker, to set in motion his demise. At the point of the Sarir's guardian wall that opens to allow for the passage of the Idaho River, Nayla opens fire on the bridge with a lasgun, destroying it as Leto and Hui are crossing, dropping them into the Idaho River. The water destroys Leto's sandworm body, decomposing it into the sand trout that will lock up the water in their bodies, recreating the conditions for the sandworms to reappear, each with a pearl of Leto's consciousness and adaptability inside it. Leto dies, his last vision, that of the Golden Path, shining brightly in humanity's future. His total reign spanned 3,509 years. During and after his reign, Leto II was viewed as an extremely controversial figure. Following Leto's death, a chain of dramatic events took place over the span of 1,500 years. This included the famine times, the scattering, and the recreation of the sandworms on Arrakis, which emerged from the sand trout that escaped from Leto's body when he fell into the water. Many of the established power brokers who existed at the start of his rule were either destroyed or significantly weakened due to his draconian tactics and a monopoly on the spice melange. To his admirers, Leto II was known as the God Emperor, but to his enemies, including the Bene Gesserit, he was labeled the tyrant of the known universe. He was worshipped by the Bene Tleilax as the prophet of God after his death. The religion of the God Emperor also continued on Dune, which became known as Arrakis. He was worshipped by the priests of the new Church of the Divided God, which became the dominant force on Arrakis and had essential control of the planet. As the Great Divided God and the third member of the Holy Triumvirate of Heaven, the others being his grandmother Jessica and his father, Muad'Dib. It was also believed by the priests of Arrakis that he had carried within him the spirit of his brother, Leto II the Elder. Leto II's prescience allowed him to see in both the past and the future, and he believed that 10,000 years of rule by the Faufer Lucius, which is a term commonly used to describe the class system employed during the days of the Carino Empire and the Atreides Empire until the reign of God Emperor Leto Atreides II, had allowed the human race to become stagnant, and that drastic action on Leto's part was needed in order for the human race to survive. The entire purpose of Leto's Golden Path was to force the human race to abandon certainty, security, and safety as individual goals, and to scatter, not only geographically, but also to do so technologically, ideologically, and sociopolitically. As a result of this philosophy, during the reign of Leto II, humanity was predominantly planet-bound and ruled by an iron fist for more than 3,500 years. This was in contrast to the relative freedom of expression and movement people enjoyed to a limited degree under the Faufer Lucius, the limits being predominantly the inherent control of feudal rule and the Spacing Guild monopoly on space travel. Indeed, Leto II exerted a level of control that was unprecedented in the Imperium, including power over the Guild and space travel, a feat that previous emperors had been unable to accomplish. Upon Leto's death, the stalwart and long-established order of the Imperium disintegrated, as did control over freedoms and movement, and as a result, humanity rediscovered independence and nobilities on an unprecedented scale. This paved the way for humanity to scatter across the universe into the unknown and further evolution of the human race. According to Leto II's plan, his death was followed by a collapse of political control and spice supplies, as it would take generations for the spice cycle to reassert itself on Arrakis. Political order collapsed and entire worlds starved to death in a chaotic period known as the Famine Times. The scattering was an immediate response to the Famine Times as refugees fled the anarchy consuming the old Imperium. It was also said that within each sandworm that grew on Arrakis after his death, a pearl of his consciousness existed. This theory was supported when, 1,500 years after his death, an Arrakeen girl named Sheena Brew, who was a direct descendant of Siona and Duncan Idaho, who later became the youngest ever revered mother of the Bene Gesserit, displayed the power to control the worms. When we compare the paths of Paul and Leto to reach their destinies, at first glance their stories might look the same. Both of them got ambushed by opposing houses and faked their deaths, unleashed their hidden potential and got crazy power-ups in the desert, and used surprise attacks on Harkonnens to get back the throne they rightfully deserved. However, Leto's story seems to be much more complex and complicated than his father's. A truly strange family saga, in truth, in which the characters act like possessed creatures or like abominations, to use the favorite terminology of the Bene Gesserit. They assume dual or multiple personalities at will. Thanks to their elastic memories, they can have visions in which the past, the present, and the future are mingled indiscriminately, very much in the tradition of the psychotic family novel. In this insane universe, Leto embodies, in all the meanings of the word, the inevitable outcome of the lineage, while Paul did not really have that kind of problem. The main problem of Paul was that he wanted to retain his humanity, while Leto knew that it was almost impossible for him to do so. If at the end of Children of Dune he confesses to being dominated by Harum, whom he defines as an ancient and all-powerful autocrat, it is most of all in God Emperor of Dune that he gives the full details of the particularly disconcerting aspects of his lunacy. Thus, he claims to be God because he is the only one who really knows his heredity. Moreover, he asserts that he is all his ancestors and considers himself a predator whose function is to ameliorate the race. Once he has become, at the end of his evolution, an antediluvian monster weighing 5 tons and being 5 meters long, he describes himself as a holy obscenity, or again as the ultimate alien. And still more, he proclaims to all, I alone am a whole population, or I am both father and mother to my people. And at last, I am Janus magnified a billionfold. In his delirium, he even goes as far as to say that he is an integral part of the planet, thus granting himself not only a universal dimension, but also a cosmic one.